One of the main human-centered reasons for conserving biodiversity is that it does things for us. It gives us ecosystem services. So in the context of climate change, one of the obvious ecosystem services is that forest biodiversity stores carbon for us. So if you think of all those trees which are out there in the tropical forests, every single one of them has woody biomass, it has woody roots, the stems, the branches. Every time a leaf conducts a bit of photosynthesis, it's taking a small amount of carbon out of the atmosphere and storing that somehow within the structure of the tree. So these are really quite important ecosystem services that people benefit from. And you could imagine that just one species is enough. You may not need thousands of species, but the advantage of having thousands is that they're all slightly adapted to different conditions. So some of them might prefer a slightly wetter climate, some of them might do better on slightly drier soils, some prefer the shade, some prefer a little bit of extra sunlight. And having all these different preferences really gives us some sort of insurance against changing conditions. So if your climate does change a small amount, there's other species which are able to step into that gap and really take advantage of it. So we maintain this service of sequestering carbon with more certainty that that service is going to be retained into the future. Forest fragmentation is something which comes almost as a byproduct of deforestation. And when bulldozers go through an area, or when small farmers are clearing areas, they always leave small patches of forest behind them. And there's many reasons for that. I mean, sometimes it's legal requirements. For example, in Malaysia, you're not allowed to clear on slopes which are higher than 20 degrees. Other times you might just come across an area which has shallow soil or waterlogged soil and it's not going to be good for your farm, and so you just leave it because it's expensive to clear land. If you can't farm it, there's no point. And so as deforestation goes on, we get left these little pockets of forest which tend to be very small. They tend to be quite isolated from each other. And they also have quite a lot of forest edge, which is quite an important concept in forest fragmentation. A lot of the negative influences of deforestation come into forests through their edges. In many ways, so forest fragmentation has these quite diverse impacts on biodiversity. A lot of them come in through those forest edges because right at the edge you're generally exposed to a much warmer and drier microclimate than you are inside a forest. There's a lot more sun there. And we also find that the vegetation changes because of that. You get a thick, dense layer of buffering vegetation which tends to spring up around the edge of the forest, whereas in the interior you might have a more open understory. We find trees at forest edges really struggle, particularly the large trees which have a very tight water balance. And so if you clear all of the forest away from one side of a tree, the humidity goes down, and that can really influence the water balance of that individual tree which is left behind. And so we find the really big trees tend to gradually die off at these newly created edges in forest fragments. A dying tree is obviously correlated with a lot of extra leaf litter which can fall down. If it's an open edge, it can be quite exposed to wind which might just blow that away, so in some circumstances you'll end up with bare ground. And all of these things play into the sensitivities of individual species. I mean, you'll find things as small as 2 millimeter long beetles which won't be within 100 meters and sometimes even a kilometer of a forest edge. They just do not like those sorts of conditions. That's true of many bird species which tend to avoid it. What we think happens for a large number of understory tropical birds is that they have very large eyes and they're quite sensitive to bright sunlight because they've never been in bright sunlight. They've spent their life under a forest canopy. And so as soon as you create that forest edge, which is this bright environment, that bird is then trapped in its forest fragment. It can't get out. And so there's this whole range of effects which feed into whether or not plants and animals can survive, and right through to these sorts of behavioural responses, such as birds which would avoid the forest edges. There is a real concern that climate change is going to exacerbate the effects of forest fragmentation. And it's something we don't really understand particularly well. There's some evidence emerging, for example, that these edge effects, which are probably microclimate driven, they can vary if you measure an edge in a low latitude versus a high latitude, which suggests that those external climatic conditions are actually determining the response of species to a forest edge. And so the expectation is that looking in one location which is fragmented and also having climate change, we would really think that you're going to get more extreme impacts on biodiversity than you see if you're just looking at climate change or fragmentation alone. I mean, forest fragmentation is a difficult thing to stop, and particularly in the tropics. Deforestation in the tropics happens to make agricultural land, and the global population is growing. We need more agricultural land. So I don't think we can just try and halt it in any particular way, but I think we can be more clever about how we design those clearances. We can, for example, go into areas which are going to be cleared, and instead of saying, well, we'll only leave behind forest fragments on steep slopes and bits which are no good for agriculture, we can say beforehand, to be ideal, a piece of forest has to be 100 hectares big or 1,000 hectares big, or whatever size threshold that might be. We can go in and say, this is what we need, and set that aside, and then just clear around it. And when we clear around it, we can leave corridors between these large pieces of forest, which again helps the movement of animals among the fragments and just promotes biodiversity within that landscape. So I think there are options to design these landscapes so that you do get that increased agricultural production which is needed, but you can do it while minimizing the impact on the natural environment which is left behind.